समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to ThePrint. This is Vidisha and you're watching Economics. Let me begin with something that at the first glance sounds like good news. State government budgets in India are expanding rapidly. Karnataka and Maharashtra, two of India's most industrialized and fiscally strong states, have more than doubled their spending over the past decade. So naturally, you would expect this to translate into more infrastructure, more investment, and stronger long-term growth. But that is not what is happening. In fact, something quieter and more consequential is unfolding. Even as governments are spending more, they are building less. And unless this changes, it will shape the next phase of India's growth story. Let's break this down. First, consider the scale of expansion. Karnataka's expenditure has risen from about 1.8 lakh crore to nearly 4.5 lakh crore. Maharashtra's has increased from roughly 2.8 lakh crore to almost 7.7 lakh crore over a similar period. These are significant increases. They reflect growing state capacity, expanding responsibilities, and rising expectations from governments. But in public finance, the real question is not just how much you spend. It is what you spend it on and what that means for the future. And this is exactly where the first chart on your screen becomes important. This chart looks at capital expenditure as a share of total spending. This is exactly the kind of spending that builds productive capacity, roads, power, irrigation, urban infrastructure. It also has one of the highest fiscal multipliers, meaning it shapes future growth, not just current demand. Now look at the trend. In Karnataka, capital expenditure was over 24% of total spending around 2020-2021. But that share has steadily declined, falling to about 15% with only a modest recovery thereafter. Maharashtra shows a similar pattern, declining from over 20% to roughly the 12 to 15% range. So while governments are spending more in absolute terms, the share devoted to building the future is shrinking. And that is the first warning sign. Now let's move to the second chart. This explains why this exactly is happening. This chart tracks revenue expenditure as a share of total spending. Revenue expenditure includes salaries, pensions, subsidies, welfare schemes, essential expenditures basically, but largely recurring. In Karnataka, this has risen from about 78% to over 80% of total spending. In Maharashtra, it remains even higher, around 85%. In simple terms, a large share of the budget is pre-committed, limiting flexibility for new investment decisions. And this is what in economics we describe as a crowding out effect within the budget. Not private investment being crowding out, but public investment being crowded out by its own recurring commitments. Now here's where the concern comes in. These commitments are sticky. Once expanded, they are politically and administratively difficult to reverse, which means that without deliberate correction, this imbalance can persist. Now let's bring in the third chart on your screen. This one looks at debt and interest payments. Both states have seen their fiscal deficits widen significantly. And as borrowing rises, so do the interest payments. In Karnataka, interest payments have more than tripled. In Maharashtra, they have risen sharply as well. And interest payments are not discretionary, they are fixed obligations. So as they grow, they increasingly constrain the fiscal space available for new investment. Now, if you step back and connect all the three charts, a clear pattern emerges. Capital expenditure is declining as a share, and revenue expenditure is rising and dominating. And most importantly, interest payments are steadily expanding. This appears less like a temporary fluctuation and more like a structural shift in state finances. And if this continues, it has implications not just for budgets, but for growth itself. Because the next phase of India's growth will depend heavily on states. States drive infrastructure, states drive urbanization, they drive human capital formation. So if their ability to invest weakens, the broader growth trajectory will feel the impact. Now, to be clear, this is not a story of fiscal irresponsibility. It is a story of competing priorities. Take Karnataka, for example. Large welfare programs have expanded significantly, creating substantial recurring commitments. In Maharashtra, a combination of subsidies, social sector spending, and a large debt stock has created similar pressures. And overlaying all of this is electoral competition, where incentives often favor visible, immediate benefits over long-term investment. So the system gradually tilts towards the present. But that brings us to a very critical question. Can states continue to expand consumption without compromising future growth? And more importantly, what happens if they don't rebalance? The answer is not to cut welfare. It is to redesign the fiscal architecture. First, better targeting of welfare. Social protection must remain central, but improving targeting and reducing inefficiencies can ease fiscal pressure without weakening support. Second, strengthening revenue capacity. Improving GST compliance, expanding property taxation in growing urban centers, and rationalizing user charges can create fiscal space in a sustainable way. Third, and perhaps most important, protecting investment through fiscal rules. This principle is simple. Governments should ideally borrow to build assets that support future growth rather than to finance routine consumption. Adapting similar principles at the state level by effectively ring-fencing capital expenditure can ensure that investment does not become the default adjustment variable during fiscal stress. Because right now, that is exactly what we are seeing. And here's the risk. If this trend continues, states may find themselves in a cycle where more spending leads to more commitments reduce investment, lower investment weakens growth, and weaker growth further constrains fiscal space. This is a slow squeeze but a powerful one. And reversing it becomes harder the longer it persists. Which brings us back to the central paradox. India's richest states are spending more than ever before. But a shrinking share of that spending is going into building the future. And the real question is not whether they can afford to keep spending. It is whether they can afford not to invest. Because in the long run, growth is not determined by the size of budgets. It is determined by their composition. And the choices being made today will define the fiscal and growth trajectory of the next decade. That is the crossroads, and how states respond to it will shape India's economic future. Thank you for watching.